I'm going to talk about the safety evaluation of extractables and leachables for e-cigarette devices. I'm part of the team at Broughton Nicotine Services, and you can see how mission statement is on the bottom of this slide here. A little bit first about my background. I'm the Director of Product Safety and Compliance at Broughton Nicotine Services, and I've come from a pharmaceutical background. I've been in big pharma and small pharma for over 30 years. Much of that time was in the development of new novel drug products, and I've been responsible for many regulatory submissions. Initially, I started off in pharma as a toxicologist, and then in my latter years there, I was involved in leading drug development teams, which are cross-functional matrix teams to bring products all the way through development into regulatory submissions and then into post-marketing space. I now have joined Broughton into a totally different industrial environment, but I want to bring some of those pharma skills into Broughton in the hope that those will help us develop high quality, safe e-cigarette products for our customers. Broughton has a range of different services, as you can see here, covering analytical chemistry, product development, toxicology, extractable and leachable testing, which I'll talk about now, scientific consultancy, project management, and regulatory services to deal with the different types of regulatory packages that are required around the world. Quite uniquely, Broughton Nicotine Services is a full service CRO, able to take a client's product from early innovation through product development and into that regulatory submission space. So let's do a deep dive into an electronic cigarette or a vaping device, if you like. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the external appearance of the device. You can see you've got a battery compartment with a rechargeable port here. You've got a tank with a coil and a wick inside it where the e-liquid goes. And these devices can be either closed, like a refillable they can be closed and have a pre-filled pod that slots into them every time with the e-liquid, or they can be open and that the top comes off and liquid can be applied inside. And then there's a mouthpiece on the top, which the consumer sucks the aerosol out of, and this is the firing button. Now, if you were to break that device down and kind of look inside in more detail, you will see that there's obviously the glass tank with the coil and the wick inside where the e-liquid goes. And then you've got various components here, like an O-ring, a fill port, a post deck, the cap and the airflow sort of units here, and the aerosol piece again. Now, all of these components potentially that make up the device, including the lining of the tank and the coil and the wick, etc., can all produce what's called extractables and leachables. So the stuff that comes out of the end is what you want the consumer to enjoy and experience. What you don't want is all the gubbins that comes off the various components here that may expose the consumer to hazards that you don't really want to have in the product. And some of these extractables and leachables can be quite unpleasant, potentially unpleasant materials, potentially metals from the inside of the device might leach through, like nickel or chromium potentially, or you might get, if some of these components are rubber, you can get extracts from vulcanized rubber products becoming into the liquid or into the aerosol as the product is used. So what we do then is we want to make a full and thorough evaluation of what those extractables and leachables might be, and if there are any of them in the product and the aerosol that comes out of the product, what is the significance of that to the consumer? So this is the matrix, which is a kind of a risk grid, a risk matrix, which shows two dimensions. It goes across the top, it shows how likely is it that leachables will end up in the aerosol for a particular product, or actually how likely is it that the leachables will end up in the end product that the consumer takes. And it goes from low to high. Now, with a solid form of presentation, like a tablet or a capsule, the migration of an extractable into that solid form is pretty unlikely. So it's a low risk. So tablets are in a blister pack or they're in a bottle, and there's not much likelihood of materials from the bottle or the blister pack contaminating the tablet. If you go to a solid powder form of product, it's a little more likely, but again, quite low. However, if you get a liquid interacting with the side of a container or various device components or pieces, it is quite likely that things will come out of that surrounding packaging into that product. Now, the other part of this matrix looks at essentially what's the significance of that if it happens, and it goes again from low to high, and this is based on the sensitivity of the organ that you're choosing to expose. For example, if you've got a tablet and you're going to give it orally, the oral system is one of the safest ways to give medications typically. So you've got a low likelihood of extractables and a low risk organ that the product is being administered to. If the material goes into the eye is more sensitive, more easy to damage than the oral route. And if you're inhaling something into the lung, you have a whoppingly large surface area that the product's going to be applied to and a highly sensitive organ for causing damage potentially. So really, this shows us that for inhaled devices, inhaled products, we are in this most sensitive, most high risk area, which is why we have to be very rigorous in assessing for leachables. So this is a slide which has been simplified massively, but I'll talk to a little bit to give you the idea of what this means. Essentially, in different parts of the world, there are different requirements for the safety evaluation, quality evaluation for e-cigarettes. So to make this a little simpler to explain, we've split it into two major markets. We've split it into the US and Europe. And in Europe, we also include the UK. And again, we've split it into two major populations of people: consumers who are taking a product for recreational purposes, self-pleasure, satisfaction of using a nicotine-containing product, and patients who want to use a nicotine-containing product but want to use the safest one that's available to them that gives them the satisfaction they want from using nicotine. So the top one here, if we start at the top and work through these, I'll give you a little bit of detail about them. Because the extractables and leachables, in fact, the regulatory requirements for each of these tend to be somewhat different. And so for a client who wants to market their product, say in the US or in Europe, depending on whether they want to reach patients in Europe, the route of application is quite different, and the regulatory requirements are quite different in each case. So let's talk through a few of these to give you an idea of what's involved. So in the US, there's this thing called a PMTA, which is relatively new, and companies are busy putting their dossiers together at the moment. And the cutoff for all these companies who want to market e-cigarettes in the US is September this year, September 2020. If companies do not submit a PMTA, they will not be allowed to license a tobacco-containing e-cigarette in the US beyond that date. Now, why is the US doing this? Well, they're doing this because they want to make sure that there's control over the quality and the safety of these products being brought to market. Now, PMTA stands for Pre-Market Tobacco Application, and there are guidelines and a rule about what is required in that, and there will needs to be a thorough evaluation of the chemistry and the toxicology of the product in terms of its components. Part of that will be E&Ls, and then there is a full risk evaluation and a quality control process around that product as it comes forward for marketing approval. All the US products are reviewed by FDA, which is the Food and Drug Association. So in Europe, if we look at Europe next, We've got two different regulations here based on who the consumer of the product is likely to be. This one here, TBD, is Tobacco Product Directive. It's European legislation that evolved in 2014. It became law in the UK in 2016. And it sets certain requirements about e-cigarettes that need to be fulfilled for the product to be able to be licensed in market. It's also e-cigarettes and e-liquids. So in a device, for example, there's a specified maximum tank size, there's a maximum nicotine content, various requirements that a product has to fulfill in terms of quality and safety reporting to be able to be approved for the UK and Europe consumer market. At the moment, there is no requirement in that legislation to do any extractables and leachables testing. However, the third iteration of that regulatory requirement is being evaluated and developed currently, and whether that will change, whether it becomes more stringent, is not known. So it could become more onerous in future as that requirement evolves. So also in the Europe and UK, there is the option to do something called an MAA, which is a marketing application authorization, which is where the product can be used in patients rather than consumers. So if a patient is a smoker and uses combustible cigarettes and they wish to stop using combustible cigarettes, if a product is approved under an AMAA, a physician can assist a patient by prescribing an e-cigarette instead of, so for them to use instead of a combustible cigarette, which means potentially that the physician community recognize the health benefits, the lower risk associated with e-cigarettes composed to combustible cigarettes, and it's to encourage patients to move away from combustible cigarettes. The US MRTP requirement is another one which is, again, none of the US ones are patient facing, they're all consumer facing, but it builds upon the top of the PMTA so that like when a drug product is developed, you have a series of claims about the product's safety and efficacy that a regulatory body will review and decide whether you've proven that in your clinical dossier and your evidence that you produce to allow that medical product to be licensed. Now, this is not a medical product, it's an electronic cigarette. However, the clients may wish to make certain claims about increased safety benefit, health benefits associated with using e-cigarettes. For example, e-cigarettes expose consumers to much fewer hazardous chemicals than combustible cigarettes. So there's a potential claim there. I think clients would like to say that using e-cigarettes has a better health outcome than using combustible cigarettes, and that would be another claim that would be potentially specified under the MRTP. And the MRTP stands for Modified Risk Tobacco Product. And what the FDA would ask a client to do is to provide the evidence that using that e-cigarette does markedly benefit a patient's health when compared to using a combustible cigarette. Now, at Broughton, we are currently working in all of these regulatory pathways, and we tailor the development package according to the pathway that the client wishes to pursue for their product. And sometimes there may be more than one. So moving on then. So how do you determine what ENLs are and what's the difference? Well, you need to establish what are the chemical entities in your device. So what's the device made of? What are its constituent parts? Where did they all come from? What are the extraction processes associated with those? And then you have to evaluate, so of those products that could come out of the device, which ones do come out of the device into the end product, as it were. So that starts off with the chemistry group doing a desk-based exercise with the client to really understand the product and how it's put together, and to come up with some risk assessment of what might come out of the product. And then they determine, based on that, they then move from desk-based into the laboratory investigation. So they'd start off doing an extractable study in the lab, which really puts the device under extreme testing to really explore what could come out of the device under worst conditions. So you might have a very long list of all sorts of potentially quite unpleasant ingredients that might be potentially extractable from that device. The next step is to narrow that down and do a leachable study. So of the ones that might come out of it, in general use, which ones do come out of it, and the ones that do come out of the device into the aerosol and therefore into the consumer, how much of them are there and what is the level that is in that product. Now, there are various guidances on these, but the one that tends to be used in the pharma industry as well is this kind of 0.15 microgram per day maximum amount, permissible amount for any leachables. As a sort of rule of thumb, is that's the cutoff for sort of ensuring that consumer safety is maintained. So the next step, the final step, is then to quantify, having quantified and qualified what's there, is that to really do the risk assessment and to make a judgment on how much impact they may have on on consumer safety. And that's done by the toxicologists who look at the extractables and leachables data and look at the levels, and then they apply it with the topography. And I'll talk about that in the next slide, what is topography, and give a judgment as to what that means for the safety of the patient, and put that into the regulatory dossier. So this is where we bring the whole piece together. So broadly, at its topmost level, there's a number of different things that happen. We've got hazard assessment, user experience, assessing the risk, and then doing the submission dossier. So under hazard assessment, we've talked about the chemistry steps. What do the chemists do to qualify and quantify those extractables and leachables? We might supplement that depending on what we find is in that chemistry pool. We might do some additional work around that. We might do some regulatory in vitro tox. These are GLP tox studies, typically things like Ames test, micronucleus test, neutral red cytotoxicity. So here we've got the three letter acronyms here. M is for mutagenicity, G is for genetic tox, and C is for cytotoxicity, which is, does it cause cell death? Of course, cell death, it can lead to irritancy, etc. And then we'd also back up whatever we were finding in the extractables and leachables with a very significant database search, literature search, to see what's already published and known, and at what quantities those constituents have been seen to be potentially harmful. Now that's great. So then we've got a good, good picture of the hazard assessment. What we then do is put it into a practical space. So with a new drug, you would have very good data about what's the exposure of a patient to that new drug, and you could do safety assessment based on that. Now with these sorts of products, you don't know that. You don't essentially know what delivered dose they have received. So because people use these electronic cigarettes in very different ways. So we do an exercise in collecting information around the topography, which really is the study of consumer behavior and consumption. So we would typically, with the client, work up some behavioral studies, like how do they use the product, how often do they use it, how many times in a day, how long do they use it for, how many puffs do they take, how long are the puffs that they take, and all these things are highly variable. So we're trying to figure out, what the worst case is of potential exposure to these hazards that we've identified. So we'd have clinical trials that we would organise and run on behalf of clients, and we would also do an extensive literature research about those types of devices, be it an open tank device or a closed device, and what can we find to sort of see in terms of what the level of exposure that people get from that. We'd also do some PK studies in here, so we know the levels of nicotine and can extrapolate that back to essentially get a handle on how much hazards from other materials they might have been exposed to. So the next step in this is the assessment of risk. So we take the hazard we determined here, and we take the exposure or potential exposure that we've determined here, put it together, and then we look at a risk. So, you know, of those things in those leachables, which might be quite unpleasant, potentially, what is the risk to the consumer? And then we explain that in the dossier. We explain to the agency, be it FDA or be it MHRA, what that exposure is, what that risk is, and potentially what that hazard is to a consumer, and therefore build a case as to whether the product is safe to use in people. And then the regulators will assess it and come to their own conclusions as whether they support that assessment or whether they disagree. And there may be an iteration around questions, etc. And eventually, if that is successful, then the product is approved for licensing in that key market. So you might be thinking, well, what happens if you don't do this? If you do not do E&L testing, what are the consequences? Well, if you go into the EU, or depending on what you're doing, if you go into the EU with a patient presenting device or liquid, you will not get the product submitted. It will not accept the application without you've done it. If you go into the PMTA, it is specified as a requirement in the PMTA. So if you don't do it, there's a fair chance you will not get the product into that substantial review space. It will just get rejected before it gets there. However, if for whatever reason you've done it and you've not done it perhaps as thoroughly as it should have been done, and if some products are found subsequently to have problems with extractables and leachables, which is not unheard of because a number of drug products have come a cropper with this in previous years. There was one drug product which was found to be contaminated with nitrosamines as a leachable from the product packaging. Nitrosamines are carcinogenic. The product was withdrawn from market. I don't think it ever made it back into market. There's also a huge reputational damage if that happens, as well as cost implications. Another product was brought forward and had phthalates as leachables, which was discovered in independent testing and again needed to be withdrawn from market. So, you know, if this happens, it is usually not good at all for the product and not at all good for the company because it's a huge reputational hit. Better to do this properly in the development plan from the start and have it properly scoped out. If you do end up having to go back and redo development, of course, you lose a lot of time because you've got to start doing development all over again and you incur a lot of extra costs, which you could have done probably much more cheaply if you'd built it in from the beginning. I'll finish up here with a slide showing the different services that Broughton can do, the sort of things we're currently doing for clients around the world, and end up with the mission statement to hope that we can get safer products into market and advance a smoke-free future. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this interesting and provocative. I deliberately tried to make it as thought-provoking as I could. And I look forward to taking any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.